Good morning and welcome to a presentation on U.S. military records. I'm Nancy Moffett and I'm presenting this on behalf of the Santa Clara County Historical and Genealogical Society. I am doing a re-recording of the presentation I gave yesterday on January 14th because the recording didn't turn out properly. So this isn't a live recording, but it's the same presentation that I gave yesterday. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is a huge topic, U.S. military records, and I'm going to be going pretty fast. But since you're listening to the recording, you can always stop and replay things or catch up on what I'm saying. I would recommend that you download the handout to follow along because most of the information that I give, the notes and websites and so forth, are all documented in that handout. So let's get started. Today, I'm going to show you ways to determine if your ancestors served in the U.S. military record, the types of records that the government kept about military service, and other non-governmental records that can help fill out the picture of your ancestors' military service. So there's good news and bad news about military records. The bad news is that many records are lost or incomplete or covered by privacy restrictions. The records that were created before World War II, before about 1910, were created after the fact and are what's known as compiled military service records, and they're pretty skimpy. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about records that exist online, but many records are only offline, and you actually have to either order the records or visit the National Archives either in Washington or St. Louis to obtain the records. But the good news is there are many records that exist, and there are records that help cover the periods of the records that were lost due to fire. And there are many non-official sources that can help offer a complete picture, or a more complete picture, I should say, to your ancestors' service. On the right, I have a picture of a military record that was obtained from the National Archives, and you can see how it's charred around the edges. There was a big fire that we're going to talk about, and that is what has led to the destruction of many more recent military records. So the official military personnel file is the file that was kept on a specific soldier, kind of like their employment file. Soldiers should have this, but it's in varying degrees of completeness. So to locate this file, you first have to understand when your military ancestor served. For discharges after 1912, those records are typically in St. Louis or with the Department of Defense. For discharges before 1912, those records are generally in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Now let me break this down more, but first let's talk about the more recent service files. These would be the files likely to be of our parents or our grandparents. So the big obstacle to the World War I, World War II type files is a giant fire that occurred at the National Personnel Record Center, that's NARA St. Louis, in 1973. The fire raged for more than 24 hours at the archives, and the destruction was so great that they were never able to figure out what the cause was. This picture here on the left is a picture of, you can probably see the men standing right there. They're standing on the top of the 6th floor of the archives that held the Army records. And the records, you can see these are the little shelves that would have held boxes of records. And here's men digging through the ashes. That fire really decimated the Army and Air Force files from World War I and World War II. Here I have a picture of the recovery effort. They pulled out as much as they could from those ashes, and they stored the records in these plastic milk cartons because they didn't, the milk cartons didn't retain moisture the way that the boxes did. Now, this fire was in July in St. Louis, and they poured water on the fire for 24 hours. So you can imagine how wet and sodden the records were and how prone they were to mold and further destruction even after the fire was over. Here we have the records that were lost, 16 to 18 million records, and the Army discharges were the ones that were most affected from 1912 to 1950. Those are 50% lost. So that would be World War I and World War II era files. The Air Force discharges were also affected mainly for World War II and beyond. So that doesn't mean there isn't a file for your ancestor if they happen to serve during those times and in those in the Army or the Air Force, but it's going to be a pretty limited file. So about 25 years later, after the fire, NARA started a program to restore these files. And here, this is a picture from the National Archives website, and it shows the before and after of a particular file that they restored. They have to remove mold, they have to add moisture to flatten it, they have to repair tears. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And I think that generally this is only done when the file is requested. I forgot to mention on the last slide that those milk cartons of boxes, milk crates of files were taken to McDonnell Douglas facility and put into a special drying thing that they had. They put in 2,000 crates at a time and did get them all dried out fairly quickly. If you're interested about this topic, and more in depth what's in an official military personnel file, you can look at some of these URLs. Mainly they're from the National Archives, and they have great information. Okay, so the question is, how do you go about finding and ordering these official military service files that are at NARA for 1910 and beyond? The first step is that you have to find someone's military service number. And here are places that you can do that. You can find it at burls.org, Family Search, NARA, Ancestry. I tend to use Ancestry, so let's go about looking at how you can find that important number, as well as look at other records that might exist on Ancestry.com. I'm at my paid version of Ancestry.com, and I'm there because most of these military records require the paid version. So you can either use your paid version at home or come to the library and use the library edition or at a family search center. And I'm going to search for any online records that might exist. So to do that, I'm going to click on search, and then I'm going to select military records. I only want to look at military records right now, and that greatly reduces the pool of results I'm going to get back. Sometimes when you do a search from that main page of Ancestry, you might get 1,000 results. I don't want 1,000 results. I want a half a dozen results. I'm going to search for my father. Now for him, I'm only going to enter, if I can spell it, his name. I'll put his middle initial and his birth year. And that's because our name is so unique. If you have a more common name, you might want to put in the exact birth date, the location of birth, possibly the death location. And if you know what branch of service, you could put that in keyword. But that's all I'm going to need to put for my dad. So I get 4 results, and I can quickly confirm those are all him. First of all, I recognize this relative name. I see his exact birth date. I do know that he was in the hospital when he was in the Army. So I'm going to look at each of these records. Let's start with the Army enlistment record. You'll notice that this is an indexed record. I don't get to see the actual record or piece of paper, but it does give me some information. His date he enlisted, that he enlisted in Camp Pickett in Virginia, that he was in the regular Army, he was a private. So I'm getting some information here, but what I do get here is his service number, and this is the number that I need to order the official military personnel file. I also, when I look at a record, I quickly look at suggested records, because these are records that other people that have my father in their family tree and ancestry have also attached to him. And one of them is the Burrell's death file, which I believe came up on my initial search, as did the Korean registration cards. So let me go back, and I'm going to systematically look at all of these records. The Burrell's death file gives me his social security number, and that's the other number I need to order records. That doesn't really give me that much more information. But what does give me more information, strangely enough, is his Korean War era draft card. These cards have just started coming online in the last 6 months, so say since June 2025. And so after he was served in World War I, he was still required to register for the draft for Korea. If I go ahead and look at the image, this proves that on this day he was not in the military, because if he was in the military, again, he wouldn't have had to register for the draft. However, if I go to the second page of this card, there's a field on here that isn't on other draft cards, but it tells me what active duty has he already fulfilled. He was in the U.S. Army. Here's his service number. These are his dates of service. When he got out of the active service, he joined the reserves. It tells me his unit and the date that he joined the reserves. So while typically draft cards are not proof of service, in this case, the Korean War era draft card is proof of World War II service. The final record I have is a hospital admission card, and this tells me when he was admitted. This was 1952. This was well after he served in World War I. This was when he was in the reserves. And it gives me some information, and it kind of confirms a story that he ended up leaving the reserves after being in a motorcycle accident. So those are the 4 records that I get for my dad showing his World War II service, and it provides the information I need to go ahead and order the records that are not online, his Social Security number and his military service number. Again, I'm at the free or at Ancestry.com at my paid version, searching only military records. So I went to search and then military. I'm going to start entering information about my grandfather. And as I do, if I type it correctly, I get this blue box that pops up. And this pops up because my grandfather is in my family tree. If I click on this, it's going to fill in all of his information. But I've found that less is more when searching for military records. When I clicked on that and it filled in his exact birth date, his exact death date, I got fewer results. And I think that that's because in some of these records, the death date is just a year and the birth date is just a year. And so when it looks for April 21st, 1887, it's eliminating some records because those records only say 1887. That's at least my theory. So I am not going to click on that to fill in the information. I'm just going to put in the birth year of 1887. We have a very unique name, and that's all I'm going to need to get his records. So I've received 8 results, and the bottom one is not him, so I received 7 good results. When I clicked on that blue box and filled in his exact birth and death date, I only got 4 records. So if you're not getting all the results you expect, back off on some of your information and take it out. So my grandfather enlisted 3 times. He tried to enlist in World War II and was rejected because he was too old, but he served in the New York National Guard. He did 2 tours in the U.S. Navy, and he also served in the punitive Mexican campaign. So I can go through and I can look at these records. This is the record about his National Guard service, which is by state. So this is a record from New York State, but it gives me his regiment here and the dates that he served. So that information could lead me to military histories for the 3rd Infantry, and I could check on these dates, where was the 3rd Infantry, and that could help me fill out his military service. Otherwise, it doesn't have a lot of information. It just says he was furloughed on March 13th, 1917 to July 20th. There are some unique records here because my grandfather was from New York. New York collected military abstracts when people got out of World War I. And different states have different records like this. This one talks about his service in World War I, that he was a coxswain and a boatswain's mate first class, and that his time of service. And because my grandfather was in the military for this part of his career, that part of his official military service record still exists in St. Louis. And it has the name of his ship, which is the USS Mount Vernon. So I could do a lot of research about the USS Mount Vernon, what type of ship it was, what types of battles was it in. It turns out that it actually wasn't a battleship, it was a troop transport ship, and I can see it go back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was actually torpedoed once. I can find all of that out now that I know the dates and the ship that he was in. It would be the same if I knew the dates and the regiment he was in if he was in the Army. These records also tell me that he was in the Great White Fleet on the ship USS Missouri, so I could do more research on that, and he was in the Mexican Punitive Campaign for the New York State National Guard. So you should go and put the information in for your ancestor and check every one of these records to see what might exist. So now that I know he was in the Navy, I can go ahead and order his military personnel file from St. Louis, or do what I did instead. One time when I was near St. Louis, I went to the archives and got it myself. So at this point, we've obtained the Social Security number and the military service number and got some other information about particular military veterans. Besides doing this on Ancestry, you can also do it on Family Search. So now we have the numbers, and the next step is to order the file online from NARA. These records, again, are in St. Louis, and here's the link that you do it. You order it online. There's no cost to do this initial request. You wait for the reply, which could take several months, and then they will tell you if the file exists, if it was burned and needs to be restored, or if the file is in full, and they'll tell you what the cost will be. The cost is $25 to $70 depending on the size, but I've never seen one for $25. They're always $70. And then you would make that payment and they would email it back to you. Also, you can go to St. Louis and order the records and view them for free. Or you can hire a researcher. There are a lot of researchers that will go to the different NARA locations and get the records for you, and that's pretty cost effective if you need more than one file. This is the letter I got back for my grandfather who was in the Navy, so we know that his file exists since the Navy files weren't burned. They said yes, they have the file, and the cost is $70. I can also go in person and see it for free, and you need to make an appointment to view the record. So I decided to hold off because $70 was a lot, and I knew at some point I would get to St. Louis and be able to look at the file myself, which is a lot more exciting. This is the letter that I got back about my dad's file, which was in the Army records that burned, and it told me that this was in an area that suffered the most damage. The separation document was not there. They will try to come up with a file and email it to me, and the cost will be $70. Because the record I seek is fire damaged and may contain mold, they would have to preserve it, and that takes several weeks. So you need to let them know ahead of time if you're going to go and look at it. Again, I did not order this. I waited until I was able to go to St. Louis. This is a picture of when I was at St. Louis. I ordered about 16 files ahead of time. I think about 3 months ahead, and of those files, 3 were complete and they were all Navy files. 12 of the files were reconstructed with just a page or 2 of information, and 1 file was not found at all. They said it didn't exist, even though I knew that it did. This is a photo of my workstation. When you go into NARA, you're allowed to bring in a computer, a pencil, and a bound notebook. You're not allowed to bring in any loose papers. And in fact, when you leave, somebody opens up your computer and shakes your notebook to make sure that you haven't hidden any archival pages, that you haven't stolen anything. And in fact, there's one person who's sitting up on a high stool in this room, simply watching people. But it was exciting to see my grandfather's complete Navy file. There were a lot of excellent things in there. Let's look at what some of those might be. One page in there listed where his pay was going to his wife, Emma Aufschlager, her address, her date of birth, and to his mother, and her address as well, and the recipients of his life insurance should he be killed in action. There was a descriptive list of all of his personal characteristics, and what I found particularly interesting were his tattoo marks. Now, this man re-enlisted 3 times, and the list was made each time he enlisted. And as time went on, the tattoo marks got larger and larger. I think they must have been out at sea and spent the whole time giving each other tattoos. One of his tattoos was that said USS Missouri, which was a ship that he was on. He had an eagle on his chest, a flag, a pig. Made in Rochester. He was born in Rochester, New York. He had a rooster on his foot. I think it's pretty crazy. There was a list of every station that he served and his rank. And there were letters that he had written. He tried to rejoin the Navy in World War II, but he was too old. And he was turned down when he went to the recruiting office. So he wrote a letter to his old naval commander, to the Department of the Navy, to the Department of War, to his congressperson, his senator. I don't remember that he sent one to the president, but maybe he did. And they kept writing back saying, "You're too old." And eventually the last letter that was in the file was the Navy Department writing to him saying, "We're going to discipline you if you keep writing letters. This is ridiculous. You can't join the Army or the Navy." So these files are really worthwhile to get if they're complete. If they tell you it's a reconstructed file, unless you're really desperate for information, it's probably not going to be worth it to get it unless you go to NARA and get it for no charge. Now, if the discharge of the veteran was less than 62 years ago, so that's about 1963, 1964, those files are closed for privacy reasons. So to go about doing this, you're probably only going to be able to get the file if you are the veteran or the next of kin of the veteran's deceased. So that would be the spouse, son, daughter, grandchild, brother or sister of the veteran. And I've never tried to get these files, but the website says that these are probably free if you're the next of kin and the discharge was less than 62 years ago. To go about ordering those, you need to submit a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and you do it through this website. Those have been generally transferred to the archives, but they're treated in a different manner. Now, there is another set of files that are available, and they're the Veterans Benefit files that are kept by the Department of Defense, which runs the Veterans Administration. And those are files that contain information about any post-separation benefits that the veteran received. If they received medical care from the VA, if they used a home loan, a VA home loan, tuition benefits, or if a survivor submitted requests for survivor benefits. So let's look at how you might go about getting that information. The other set of records that I can try to get are the VA files, the Veterans Administration files about my father. The way that you do that is you go to this website from Reclaim the Records called BIRLS.org, BIRLS.org, and that stands for the Beneficiary Identification Record Locators System or something like that. They make it really easy at this site. You just scroll down and you click on Start Your Free Search and you add in the name, James F. Slicker, and then his social security number that I got from the ancestry form. 0920. And click search. I had to scroll down to find the search button. And there I've got him. There's one person with that name. I can confirm that date of birth and death. And that is my guy. If I click on this little arrow here, I get a little bit more information. I get his enlistment dates, his active duty dates. And this button here allows me to immediately submit a FOIA request for the veteran. It's not complicated. You know, it sounds like submitting a FOIA request is complicated. No, it's not. I just click this. I could add some extra information, such as his veteran service number, which I've typed in what I think it is based on another record. I go to the next step and I enter my information. I agree to the terms. I do an electronic signature and I send the FOIA request. So that is very simple to do. Now you'll likely get back some very minimal information. This is the letter I received back and it gave me virtually no information. Certainly no information that I didn't have, but you can appeal the information that they send you, and that information about how to do that is also at the website birls.org/appeal, and you should go ahead and do that. There's no cost to it whatsoever. So in summary, we've talked about 3 different ways to go about getting the files that are specific to one particular military service member. The official military personnel file for a military release that less than 62 years ago, you need to get from NARA, and you do that by doing an order online. If the military release was less than 62 years ago, you need to do a FOIA, and you can only do that if it's for your own file or if you're the next of kin. And anyone that served in World War I or more recently and used veterans benefits, they might have a veterans benefit file, a BURL file, and you do that using a FOIA request through the birls.org website. There are other official records that may exist for your ancestor. These were reports that were created by each military unit that detailed who was in the unit at that time, who was transferred, who was away without leave, who was on furlough, who got injured, who was promoted. And those reports for the Army and the Air Force, or the Army Air Corps, are called the morning reports, and those were actually completed every day. For the Navy and Marines, there were muster reports, and those were created every 2 weeks or every month for the same general purpose. The morning reports are for early World and before and through World War I are on Fold 3, and for World War II they're slowly coming online at NARA, and I've got the links for that. And the Navy and Marine muster reports are on Ancestry.com. Let's look at those a little more in depth. So using the link I provided for fold 3 for World War I era morning reports, I get to this form and I've added the surname Drumhiller to look for morning reports. And I've received, I think, 6 or 7 hits. If I receive too many hits, I could add more search fields here. For example, maybe I could add the person's initials. I could say Drumheller SE, because his initials were SE, and that seems to be how the names appear in the reports. I could further add dates or places using these fields here, but I didn't get too many, so I just go ahead and start clicking on any of these. I guess there's really only 3 that might be him because his name was not Fred. And this is what a morning report looks like. There's a lot of legal or abbreviations, military abbreviations, some of which you might be able to figure out. But if you can't, you could upload this to Gemini or some other AI bot and probably get a pretty good explanation of what they say. One interesting thing about this is my grandfather's name was Drumheller, but every single military record that exists has him as Drumhiller. So one thing when you're on Ancestry doing that initial search, figure out what the spelling is, because that's probably going to be the spelling, even if it seems wrong, the spelling in all military records. So here we have the month of March, and we've got the 25th, the 26th, the 27th. Down here on the 30th, what I see is that the following appointments were announced on 3/38, which I would assume is probably March 28th, and that's a typo, 1918, effective March 16th, 1918. That Drumheller, SE, became the sergeant first class. So this is announcing my grandfather's field promotion to sergeant first class. So that would have been a pretty exciting day for him. Okay. I'm at the National Archives, the link that is included in your handout for the morning reports. These are the morning reports for World War II. They're not currently on fold 3, only an index is on fold 3, which isn't very helpful. If you're looking for an actual name, you need to come to the National Archives catalog. What you do then is click search within this series. Now what this other information here is telling me is that the records are from 1940 to 1946. They're only partially available online, but there's 54 million digital objects. That's an awful lot. And then there's more information about the morning reports that you can read, but I'm going to look for a name, so I'm going to search within this series. And luckily I have a very unique name. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how you're going to wade through it if you're looking for Smith or Brown or William. But for Aufschläger, this works quite well. All I need to do is put in the surname and search. And I have 24 results. Now, both my father and my uncle served in World War II. And because my dad went in towards the end of the war, these are going to more likely be for my uncle. But let's see, let's click on one of these. There were 24 results. And when I get here, I've got a whole bunch of images that are showing. And it appears that what's happening is that the image numbers that are here are the images on this particular tape that have the name Aufschläger on it. So let me just pick one random. Oh, and also at NARA, these all seem to be scanned sideways, which is very weird. Now, here I am, and supposedly that my name is on this record. What I often do is go back a few records to figure out exactly what I'm looking at. What's the unit, who made this report, and so forth. So I have that in another window. So a few records back, I see that it's the morning report for the 7th Air Depot Group. And then that record that I just saw that was sideways, here I see Sergeant Opslegger from furlough to duty. So this is my uncle. He was in the air group as a mechanic. And when he was in the Army Air Corps, he married a woman from Belfast. And here, if I read a little further, I can see that this next guy, Private Guzik, went from Victoria Barracks, Belfast to duty. So he came from Belfast and joined this squadron group. So that is an indication that probably my uncle is pretty close to Belfast, possibly where he met his wife. So if you're looking for World War II morning reports, you have to do so from the National Archives. Now, looking for U.S. Marine Corps muster rolls, you can do that from Ancestry. And what I would do is I would go to the card catalog by doing search and then card catalog. And in the keyword box, I would put in Marine muster. Ignore that little line in the middle. That's my cursor when I took the screenshot. So Marine muster, and a set of titles come up. And I'm most interested in the U.S. Marine Corps muster rolls. So I would click on that blue link. And what comes up is a search form that's for this particular database only. And here I've put in Elmer F. Helfman and press search. And I received 54 results. Only about the first 25 are actually for this particular person. But just even with the indexed information, I get a lot of information about his service. I get his rank and the date of the muster and the company that he was in. So using all of these things, I could make a timeline of his service. But I can also go ahead and click on View Image. And I get the actual muster roll that has his name on it. And it shows his enlistment date, and again, more military lingo that you might have to decode. Robert tells me that if you go to the very end of that muster roll, there's a key that shows what a lot of these things mean, or you could type this into an AI bot. So here I have the date. This is it for a 2-week period, I guess, January 18th to 31st in 1941. And it's the muster roll. It talks about each individual person that was in the company. Okay. Oh, and there's Elmer. So we've talked about the location of some official military records. We've talked about the morning reports, the muster reports, the burial files. There are also other reports offline at the National Archives. Beyond the official military personnel files, there's lists of killed in action, prisoners of war, casualties. There's unit records. That would be records about the particular unit that your ancestor served in that may or may not mention them. We talked about the burial files, but Pam Fuji, my co-teacher in the beginner classes, has gotten a lot of information from JAG reports and confinement reports that she received after writing to individual military locations. She has an ancestor that was in Leavenworth after being convicted of being away without leave. There are some blogs here that I've listed, and they're also in your handout that can give further information about some of these things. Also, Fold 3, even though it's a subscription site, there's a lot of databases that are free. So you might as well go to Fold 3 and browse. And if you find something you want to look at that isn't free, you should go ahead and get a Santa Clara County Library card, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, so we're still talking about World War I and beyond. You might have information about ancestors in your own house. I know people tend to think they don't have this information, but looking around my house, I found a bunch of stuff, and maybe you will too. Maybe you have family lore or photos. This is my dad on a ship going over to Austria, after World War II. Maybe you have letters. Maybe you've seen headstones or newspaper articles. I have my dad's flat cap from the Army and one of his medals. I've got a telegram that he sent to his parents when he was coming home. And this here is VMail, Victory Mail, and this is from World War II. At some point in World War II, they realized that the mail was out of control. And what they decided to do, instead of taking all the letters across and distributing them, they would take microfilm images of all the letters and then reprint them close to the front in Europe. And so instead of taking thousands of bags of mail, they were able to take just a couple of bags of microfilm. And this is actually, this is a letter to my dad. So it was going over to Austria. When I was teaching this class yesterday, David Kerbout mentioned the movie that's currently on Netflix called the 8666, or maybe just the 666. It's about a Black female organization in the Army that went to tame the mail problem during World War II. And I have seen that as well, and I do recommend that movie. Here's a couple of headstones. One is of my great uncle, and it says that he was a private in the infantry, the replacement infantry regiment for World War I. He did come back from World War I, but was entitled to a military headstone when he did pass away. The one on the right is a headstone, a private headstone for my uncle, George, who we saw the report about him, the morning report about him in the Air Force, and his wife, who was from Ireland. So sometimes even headstones have clues to military service. And these are a couple of newspaper articles. One is published talking about who enlisted that week. Another is an obituary that talks about the service of a person. He was wounded in France during this particular battle in the fall of 1918 and received the Purple Heart. All of these are clues and information that can help fill out your ancestors' service. And once you know, I think I mentioned this earlier, once you know what units people served in, you can get information about that particular unit. This is a newspaper article that appeared after my dad got back from World War II, and it talks about the first ship that he was on sprung a leak and they had to go back, and the second ship ran into a sandbar off the Jersey coast, and he had kind of a rough return voyage. All interesting information that helped fill out someone's service history. We're going to look at a few other online records that are not necessarily official records, although I guess the Army enlistments are, but other records that can help fill out the service information about your ancestor. The one I'm not going to talk about are websites and Facebook groups. Many military units or ships have websites or Facebook groups that have photos posted that talk about reunions that occurred. So always remember to try and Google or look in Facebook for information. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about are state sources. At this point, you should have already checked the logical places for records, but you might not think of checking states for federal military service. However, you should do this because often, especially after World War I and World War II, states and counties collected military information about people returning from war. Sometimes it was because they were proud and they wanted to have that information. Sometimes it was because those people were allowed additional benefits. New Jersey, for example, had pensions for returning soldiers. And in the case of the missing Army files, this might be your best way to find the information. So this is an example of records from New York State. and they have abstracts of World War II, World War I military service. And here is a tiny link for going to the Family Search Wiki and looking up state sources. Okay, and it's talking about how this could be a replacement for information destroyed in the fire. This is one of those World War I cards, and this is for my grandfather, Sidney Drumheller. And it has his residence. It shows when he enlisted. And notice that the date, June 28/17, means the 28th of June, 1917. It talks about what organization he was in. He was in the same organization from when he enlisted until he discharged. It says he had an honorable discharge on demobilization when that unit was sent home, and when he served overseas. So that's quite a bit of information that was not available in his official military personnel file, which was never found. So don't forget about Google. With that information that I just received from the card, that he was in the 306 Signal Corps Company C, I just Googled that and I found an image online and a unit history of that organization. This is the unit history, and it was created in Rochester. I suspect that most of these people were from Rochester. It was printed in 1938 in Rochester, and it actually had a little piece about my grandfather, Sidney Drumheller. He was a sergeant. It talks about where he was from, when he enlisted. In France, his bravery and devotion to duty gained him the unstinted praise of his comrades and officers. He worked in the Vosges Mountains along the Lorraine front and on the Verdun front, was aided materially in the successful operations of the famous Wildcat Division. When the Happy Gang disbanded, Sid made a wild dash for Rochester, while all predicted that his next march would be to the tune of Mendelssohn's. He did go home and immediately married my grandmother. So these war history books can have a lot of information. It also led me to this photo. I know when my grandfather served. I know that he was in Vosges, France on October 22nd, so it's very possible, even though I can't identify him, that he's one of these men eating lunch. And another picture was of the unit mustering in South Carolina right before they left for Europe. And again, I can't identify my grandfather, but he's likely in this photo. Perhaps you've heard of the Stars and Stripes newspaper. It's a newspaper run within the Department of Defense and funded by Congress, and it was designed to provide credible news to the military community. It actually began way back in the Civil War and is still going today. During World War I and World War II, some of the editions were published very close to the front in order for the latest information to get to the troops. And here you can see an example of what you can find in the Stars and Stripes newspaper. I didn't actually have any luck looking for any of my ancestors' names, but that doesn't mean you won't find information. But I was able to track a division's location and its insignia, just doing searches for the Stars and Stripes newspaper. There are a lot of sites that track military burials and military headstones, and these are some of the better ones. There's probably 30 different individual databases on Ancestry that you can get to by going to the card catalog, searching on military records and with the keyword burial, and you'll find a lot. This first one, the U.S. Headstone Applications, is a database of everybody that has applied to receive a military headstone from the VA. These are for headstones that are in independent cemeteries, not in military cemeteries. There's a locator of everybody that's buried in national cemeteries. and there is one for American burials overseas, and there are several sites that are virtual memorials that are not information about cemeteries, but about service people that died, particularly during battles, and are buried overseas. So let's take a look at a couple of those. This record is from Ancestry's military headstone database, and it's for a headstone that we looked at a little bit earlier for my great uncle Nicholas J. Euler, a private. And even though there was information on his tombstone, there was more information on the card. The information that I've circled in green is what's on the tombstone, but there was more information about his military service on this card, that he was in Company K, his military service number, his enlistment date, his discharge date, the actual location of the cemetery is there. And I think on the back is the name, the back of this card, the name of the person that requested it. And up here, it's written, it says he was born in Germany, which is an interesting fact for someone that fought for the US in World War I. So that's a pretty simple search on Ancestry. Just put in the person's name and you can come up with these, especially if you see a tombstone like this. These are flat markers. There are a couple of types of markers, but if you see something that looks like this, that's a pretty standard size and shape, you can guess that it's a military issue and go ahead and look for a card like this. This is an example from the We Remember database, no, the Field of Honors database. The Historical Society was asked when this database was being put together to help research some of these veterans from Santa Clara County. And this is one that I had worked on to find information about this young man, and I wrote to his family and actually got this photo that was uploaded to the database. So it has information about his family, his date of birth, his date of death, and some biographical information about him. He was drafted into World War I and died in, I believe, Belgium. So there's a lot of memorials like this where you can find information. There are virtual sites about people that died in Pearl Harbor, and a lot of various cemeteries in Europe. You might find one about your ancestor, especially if they died and were buried overseas. Okay, so now we're going to talk about pre-World War II records. Oh, I'm sorry, this should say World War I records. Records created before 1910. Okay, and there's challenges here as well. These military records are compiled. We're going to talk about what that means in a minute. Different numbers are used for different purposes. So you might think that you have a military service number, but it might be a pension number or a pension application number, and that can be confusing. Because the military records are compiled, you can't really start with the compiled service records. You have to have more information about your person before you can determine which record is theirs. And a lot of these records are only at Archives 1, which is at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Okay, so now we're going to talk about compiled military service records. Before 1910, individual soldiers and sailors did not have their own personnel record. There were certainly records about the war. There were hospital records. There were killed in action reports. There were muster reports, but these were all created for different purposes, and none of them were filed into a folder for an individual sailor or soldier. Well, once the U.S. started offering veterans benefits, survivor pensions, land bounty and so forth, there was no real way to determine if an individual soldier actually served for the military. They would have to go through hospital reports and all different kinds of reports to try and find this person's name. Well, in about, I'm not sure what it was, in the late 1800s, a guy named General Ainsworth was hired to try to figure out what to do about this problem. His department was in charge of going through hospital records to help decide which Civil War pension claims were valid and which weren't. And there was no index to soldiers and there were no personnel files, so this was really hard. There was a huge backlog of pension records. The government was getting a lot of pressure about processing pension records quicker, and so he was tasked with figuring out what to do. So what he did is he had a huge company of clerks go through all of the hospital lists and create a history for soldiers from those hospital rolls, and they copied the information onto individual index cards. And then they went on to look at all of the POW records and the muster rolls and any other records that this team could find. And when the project was complete in 1890, they had created over 7 million carded records for soldiers during the Civil War. And then they sorted these first by unit and then by soldier, and they had a bunch of index cards for individual soldiers. And these cards are what comprise a compiled military service record. And this picture here from the National Archives shows all of these clerks with these bundles here on their desks, and each bundle is an individual compiled service record, trying to finish the job of compiling all these records. After they did the Civil War, they went ahead and did the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Indian Wars, the Mexican Wars, and so on. And so for all of these wars that are listed here, there are compiled military service records. Now notice that there aren't compiled military service records for people that did not serve during conflict times. There was certainly people serving between 1848 and 1861. But unless someone served during one of these conflict times, they're not going to have a compiled service record. And you can read further information about compiled service records here at this website. Okay, so this is what a compiled military service record looks like. And there's an envelope, which is the picture on the left, with the number on the card number of all of the different cards. And this particular person, Edwin Peters, he was in Battery L of the 1st New York Light Artillery, and he was a private when he went in, and he was a private when he came out. And this is an envelope, I think I said, and in that envelope are these individual cards. And this is one of the cards. Oftentimes you get a single card or just 2 cards, and they're not very helpful. In this example, Edwin Peters, in September and October of 1863, he was absent, and he was absent sick since August 21st, 1863. Sometimes the cards are blank and just say that his name was on a muster roll. But as you can see, unless I actually know that my guy served in this military unit, there's no individual information about him that tells me that this is for sure my guy. And this is why you have to get additional information before you start the search. So a strategy for success in pre-1910 records is to first find out as much as you can about the person before diving into military records. Try to verify if they served. Try to figure out what unit they were in. Try to understand where they were living before the conflict began. And then broaden your thinking to non-military records, such as unit histories, state records, grave records, etc. So first, you're going to look in your files for a likely candidate who served based on the age and where they were living using a chart that I'm going to show you in a minute. Then you need to look for genealogical records that have clues to their service. Then try to find out if those records are online, generally Fold 3, Ancestry, or Family Search. And if they're not online, then you need to order the records, go to Washington, or hire a researcher. Now, this chart is great, and I use this a lot to try to identify when people might have been serving in a conflict. Now, notice that this only talks about conflicts. This doesn't cover people that might have served in peacetime, but this does help, especially for pre-World War I, when the records really only exist for people that served during conflicts. And you can find this chart online pretty easily by just Google birth years of veterans chart. It's all over the internet. So if we look carefully at the first box here for the Revolutionary War, the reason I like it is it quickly figures out for me already what the likely birth years are of a person that served in the Revolutionary War, and then further it tells me the battle years. So if you have someone that was born in the U.S. or that was living in the United States during these years, 1775 to 1783, and was born in this range, they're a good candidate for someone that might have served in the Revolutionary War. Okay, so once you find a candidate, then you need to do some research about that person and figure out, did they possibly serve in the war? And we're going to look at some of these things. There's clues in census and family memorabilia, gravesite locators, various databases, patent records, and genealogy databases. So, tombstones, obituaries, family stories are three items that have helped lead me to finding records for people in the Civil War. For example, I have this tombstone that we're going to be looking at a little bit later for Edwin Peters. He's the guy that we just saw his compiled military service record. He was in the J Regiment of the New York Light Artillery, and this is a cemetery tombstone that I found. So this gave me the information to figure out which compiled military service record was his. Here's an obituary for William Hicks, and it tells me that he served in Company I of the 15th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. That's enlarged right down here. And I had a story from my mother that when they visited her grandfather's house in Virginia, her grandfather had a big gun over the fireplace. And her grandfather said that the dad of the grandfather used it to shoot Yankees in the Civil War. Well, my mom had to ask her mother, what's a Yankee? And her mother said, well, we're Yankees. We're from New York. And after that, my mother was always afraid to go to Virginia into that house because people shot Yankees with that gun. So those kind of things might help you get started figuring out where someone served. Now, we've all heard that the 1890 census was destroyed. And while that's true for the main census schedules, one of the things that did partially survive is the Veterans Schedule. Specifically, it's known as the Surviving Soldiers, Sailors, Marines, and Widows, etc. schedule. And this survives for states alphabetically after Kentucky. Alabama through Kentucky was destroyed, but this is an example from New York, and these are on Ancestry.com. You can use the card catalog to search only for this schedule. If you go search card catalog and then in the keyword you put 1890 Veterans Schedule, you will find this. And here I have down on line 29, it says that Griffin Michael, alias Buckley Michael, was a private in Company A of 52nd Regiment of the New York Infantry, and it has his enlistment dates and his discharge dates. So that's excellent. That gives me information that could lead to records. But there's actually more on this form. If you go down to the bottom, here we were on line 29. The bottom of this form tells me that his address was Palmyra, Wayne County, New York, and that he had a disability. He had a gunshot wound in his left leg. And under the remarks column, it says that he was a member of the Garfield Post of the GAR. The GAR stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. So this was kind of a veterans club for veterans of the the Civil War. So we have a lot of information about him. We know where he lived, even despite the lack of the regular 1890 census. And this isn't just men, as we noted in the previous slide, widows were included. Anybody receiving a pension benefit would be included here. So there are women on these forms as well. And again, it exists for states alphabetically after Kentucky. The government created this special form because they were trying to figure out, this is 1890, the Civil War ended decades prior. They're still trying to figure out how long are we going to have to be paying off these guys? What's our war liability for the Civil War for the people that are still alive? The 1930 census also has clues in field 31. There's a question that asked, it's blown up here, is this person a veteran? And if it's a blank or has the word no, then obviously it's no. If there's a yes, then it also goes on to ask what conflict or war. And it was collecting data for World War I, Spanish-American War, the Civil War, the Philippine Insurrection, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Mexican Expedition. And if someone served in more than one, it seems as though they write the most recent thing. The 1940 and the 1950 census also have supplementary questions about military service. And also, when you're looking through a census, a lot of times large gaps in children's births can be a clue. It's possible that children died in between there, but it's also possible that if during the time when, say, the Civil War was happening, there were no children born, but there were children born before and after, that the father was away in war during that gap time. Okay, the National Cemetery Administration, which is run by the VA, has a database that contains burial locations of veterans and their family members in VA cemeteries, also in state cemeteries and other Department of the Interior cemeteries. So if someone's buried on national property, their grave should be included here. So this is another place that you can look for information about soldiers. Okay, one of the great resources for the Civil War is the Civil War Soldiers and Sailor Database. This is run by the National Park Service, and it has information about individual soldiers, sailors. It has regiment histories. It has information about cemeteries and battles, people that were prisoners. If you happen to have someone famous, maybe that has a monument, it has information about that and about the medals that were given out, specifically the Medal of Honor. So simply searching for a person's name in here that's a likely candidate for the Civil War may give you more information. There are a lot of county military histories. These were created around the turn of the century, and by that I mean around 1900. The Civil War soldiers were passing on rapidly, and different localities wanted to remember them. And so they created these books that talked about especially the regiments that came from the area, people who served in those regiments, the outcome of their war experience. Were they wounded? Did they make it home? Did they die in action? And you can find these by using this Google search term here. And what I would do is, in quotes, I would put the name of the county in the state, and then all in capitals. That tells Google this is another required search criteria. In quotes, maybe Civil War or military history. And an example would be how I found this particular one, Monroe County, Iowa, and Civil War or military history. And I found a book called The Illustrated History of Monroe County, Iowa. And here is an example of one of the pages that talks about people that were there. So if you know where the person was living, say in 1860, look for an illustrated or a county military history for that location. You can also simply try Googling a place name like a state and the word Civil War. And here I did it for Wisconsin, and I found that the Wisconsin Historical Society has information about 9,100 young men that left Wisconsin to fight in the South. And that the Wisconsin Veterans Museum has information about individuals from Wisconsin that served in the Civil War. So there is a lot of information out there, but you have to look in sources that are outside of Ancestry.com to find this information. And another way that one can determine if someone served during wartime, especially say the Revolutionary War and early time War of 1812, is if they received military land bounty. At this early time in the United States, the government didn't have a lot of money, so instead of giving out pensions, they were giving out land in what was considered the West at that time, say Ohio, Illinois, Missouri. So you can check to see if someone received a military bounty land at this website, and the URL is here. It's also in your handout. And all you need to do is go to search, type in a location, a county if you know it, and a state. And this might be, another clue might be if the family moved, especially before the Civil War out west. You could try searching at the location where they were living at the time of the Civil War. In this case, I just did Michigan and the name Daniel Peters. And I was able to find this record of military land bounty. And this tells me that Daniel Peters, who was a private in Captain Ireland and Richardson's company of the New York Volunteers in the War of 1812, received a piece of property. Now, you may have people that received military bounty land but never moved. And this land was deeded to the veteran, and they could do whatever they wanted with it. They could move out there, they could give it to a family member, they could sell it to somebody. And there were a lot of land prospectors that were buying military land bounties for pennies on the dollar from veterans and then doing some land speculation. So you should go ahead and check this database because prior to 1855, they might have received bounty land instead of cash. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. For the Civil War, we're going to look for someone of the right age. We're going to look at some of those information pieces. We're going to try to find the file. To begin researching Civil War records, I first need to have a candidate for a person that would have fought in the Civil War. And so I go to my birth year of veterans chart, and I can see that for the Civil War, the birth years of someone that's likely to have participated in the Civil War were between 1811 and 1848. I have a person in my tree named George Peters. He was born right in the middle of those years, 1835 to 1836. He was born in New York, and he was living in Macedon, Wayne County, New York. So now I have a candidate. What I was telling you earlier is you have to have more information than just the name of the person in order to make sure you're researching the right person in the military records. And let me show you why that is. I just went to Fold 3, which is a military records website run by Ancestry. It is a subscription site, but when we talk about researching Revolutionary War records a little bit later, I will show you the way that you can use this resource without buying a subscription. So what I've done is I've entered in George Peters as a name, New York as a place, and the Civil War. And I've received 131 results for George Peters and George Peter and Peter George, because it's given me all of those things. That's one of the unique challenges when you have a person that has a last name that could also be a first name. So I am not going to slog through all of these George Peters in New York. Some of them I could easily eliminate, but there's just too many. I have to have more information to find my record. So I did some more genealogy research, and I found a book called The Military History of Wayne County, New York. I found this book on archive.org. And when I looked through the book, I found George Peters, and it's got dates when he enlisted. He was in the 111th Infantry, Company A. He was killed in the Wilderness. That was a Civil War battle on May 6th, 1864. And I also noticed right below is an Edwin Peters, and he did have a brother named Edwin. And he enlisted the 20th of October, 1861 in the 1st Artillery Company L. He died June 13th, 1864 of sickness at Macedon and is buried there. So I have every reason to believe that these are brothers. I have the additional clue that Edwin was buried there, meaning Macedon, New York. I did do a search on Ancestry for the 1860 census to look and find out if there were any other people named George Peters or Edwin Peters living in the county at that time, and there were not. So I'm fairly confident that this is my Peters family. Because I knew that Edwin was buried in Macedon, I went ahead and looked for his gravestone, and I found these two buried next to each other in the Union Burying Ground in Macedon, New York. Since they're adjacent graves, I have further reason to believe that they're related. Now, Edwin died of sickness in Macedon. George died in a battle in Virginia. What do you think that tells us about these two gravestones, these two graves? Well, it means that probably only one has a body in it. Edwin died in Macedon, so we have every reason to believe that he died in Macedon and was buried in that grave. George Peters, however, died 500 miles away in Virginia. And in the Civil War, they were not shipping bodies back to be buried. So we can be pretty confident that Edwin's in his grave and George isn't. But they were both entitled to military headstones, and so someone must have gone ahead and ordered the headstones and installed them. So now I have some details about the military outfits that they were in, and I can go back to Fold 3 with more information and receive a better set of returns. Okay, back at Fold 3, and I still have my search George Peters, New York, Civil War, but now I'm going to add Company A. And you'll notice it's asking, do I want that to be a keyword, a name, or a place? I want that to be a keyword. So, wow, I'm still getting 68 results, but I can quickly glance down and look for somebody that was in Company A. And here I have George Peters. It's the Civil War Pension Index. He was in the infantry, Company A, Regiment 111. So that is probably our guy. That matches everything that was on his headstone. And what I see here is the index card to the pension files. This is for George Peters. He's dead. He was in Company A, Regiment 111 of the New York Infantry. On February 7th, 1867, his mother filed a pension application. This is the application number, and this is the certificate number. Now, when you see a certificate number, then you know that the pension was issued. If this field is blank, then no pension was issued. If this number is full, you know that a pension application was made. Both of these files have a lot of really great information, and if you can come up with a number, then you can order the pension file. When you find something like this, you've got to figure out what is the general index to the pension file. And how do I get that pension file? This is when I always go to the Family Search Wiki. I searched on general index to the pension files, and I get all kinds of information about it. And the pension index actually covers multiple wars. We're looking for the Civil War. Oh, that's not exactly what I wanted. And it tells me what is the information that's in the pension file and how do I go about getting the pension record. And unfortunately, it says the actual pension records that the organization index and the general index cards referred to are currently only available through the National Archives. So these records are not online, and you have to either go to Washington, D.C., hire a researcher to do it, or order the pension files. One summer, about 8 years ago, my daughter had a summer internship in Washington, D.C., and I went and visited her, and I have been saving up pension record requests for many years, and I went to the National Archives in downtown Washington and ordered the files. To view the files, you have to fill out a request for military record card, and it looks quite a bit like the actual index cards that we found online. That's no coincidence. They did it so that they would be easy to fill out. So once you fill out these requests and turn them in, a couple hours go by, and then you get the files. You're told that the files are ready for you in the reading room. I thought it was pretty crazy that I filled out this card, and then a couple hours later, they handed me a packet of documents that were 150 years old. It was as if they were giving me a library card application or something. It was quite crazy, but let me show you the kind of things you might find in one of these files and why they're worth getting. So for George, he's our guy that died in action at Wilderness, and I found this casualty sheet in his file, and it says that the nature of his casualty was a slight wound, and he received it on May 6th, 1864. Another card said that he was killed, and he was killed in the field on May 6th, 1864. Another card verified that he was from Palmyra, which is the next town over from Macedon. He was born in Macedon. Oh, he enlisted in Palmyra. So I know that this is my guy, and he died apparently of a slight wound on the same day that he received it. He also had filed for a disability, and actually he didn't file this. The surgeon filed this and said he was disabled. They were going to send him home apparently, but then he passed away. Also in George Peters' file, I found the thing that I had been looking for years. This is the pension application file that his mother filed. Actually, it's the summary of it. Sarah Peters is his mother. She's aged 50. She's the wife of Zuri Peters. How's that for a name? Xury. And the mother of George Peters. And it talks about that where and when he died. Further, Sarah Peters is married to Zuri Peters. They married in West Macedon, New York on the 6th of November, 1831. This is the only record that I have of their marriage. Those marriage records were not being kept in that place at that time. They were married by the Justice of the Peace, Mr. Thompson. And before she was married, her maiden name was Sarah Van Camp. So there's a lot of other genealogical information, but it had that one nugget, the mother's maiden name. So this is why getting these files is worth the effort, and I highly recommend it. Okay, now we're going to use the same process for locating files about a Revolutionary War soldier. Back when I used to teach this class online during COVID, one of the participants had asked how could they figure out if their ancestor Henry Lorsbau served in the Revolutionary War. And they had some information about him, that he was born in 1751 in Pennsylvania and died in October 1841 in Stark, Ohio. So our approach is to try to verify service, and we're going to use the DAR database for that. And let's see how you would go about doing that. I'm at dar.org, and I want to see if I can find our guy in the DAR Patriots database. This database has a list of many, but not all, DAR, and in quotes I'm saying patriots. A patriot is someone that either served in the Continental Army or provided goods or aid to the military. So it's not necessarily proof that someone fought, but it is proof that they assisted. So I'm at the main page, and I'm going to go to the genealogy tab. And from there, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to search on ancestors because I want to see if this guy is a patriot and perhaps has military files. So here you can enter just as much or as little as you want. You have to put one of the starred items, either first name, last name, or ancestor number. The ancestor number is the internal DAR number. You're not going to know that. But I'm going to try just putting LORSH because we have a lot of possible name variations. His first name is Henry, and we know that he was born in Pennsylvania. And here we use the two-letter modern postal abbreviation, and press search. So it's saying it didn't find any names that start with LORSH, but I should try Lushbau, which could be a variation of the name we're looking for. I click on that and there's no records found. So I'm going to go back and refine my search by pressing that key. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some information out because it's trying to match all of these fields. I'm going to take out the state of birth, and I guess I'll just leave it like that. Okay, again, it's telling me to go to Lushbau. And there is a Henry Lushbau. Now, why didn't it come up the first time? Because under birth, it has a year, but it doesn't have a place. And it was trying to match my place of Pennsylvania. So this is a record of the Patriot at DAR, and it's telling me it's got his birth date, his death date, it's got his pension number, which is what we're actually looking for. So I'm going to copy and paste that by highlighting, right-clicking my mouse, and doing copy. It tells me his service. So this person, this Henry Lushbau, was in the military, and he served under these people. Here's his residence in Pennsylvania, Northumberland County. Here's his spouse. And these are the names of all of his children. So that's giving me enough genealogical information to know that this is indeed the right Henry Lushbau. There it's got his death in Stark County, Ohio, which we knew that as well. Let me show you a couple things about the DAR database before we move on. If I click on this red, it's like a little family chart, it tells me that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different people that have received membership into the DAR through Henry Lushbaugh. And if I click on, again, the red family tree, it gives me the lineage of the person that applied, keeping living people private. So here's our patriot, Henry Lushbaugh. Henry Lushbaugh had a son named John. So number 8 here is the child of Henry. Number 7 is the child of John, and so on. So you can get a lot of lineage information here from the DAR website. And if you go through each of these could be different children and different lines. You can get a lot of information. The DAR does vet the information, and it's generally pretty good, but once in a while you'll see a big red banner that says you need to prove lineage again. The way that you can join the DAR is you find one of these lines and connect yourself to the line. You don't necessarily need to connect yourself way back to the original patriot, but sometimes they've discovered issues in some of the genealogy. Maybe some of the early people that applied didn't have quite the strict level of documentation that they have now. Okay, so on my clipboard, I have the patriot number of Henry Lushbaugh, and I'm going to remember how this is spelled, because this is going to be the way that it's going to be spelled in military records, not the original name that we had. So with that information, I'm going to come to the Santa Clara County Library District website, not Santa Clara City, Santa Clara County, because they offer Fold 3 for free if you have a library card. The way you get to it is you go to the online library, then A to Z resources, and then Fold 3. And here it is. They have a tutorial about how to use it, but I'm going to press Access now because I want to get into the database. Here I have to enter my library card and PIN. Okay, so now I'm at the main menu of Fold 3, and I am going to enter, first I'm going to check Revolutionary War because I don't want to look for the person Henry Lushbaugh with all the wars, only the Revolutionary War. And I can put in, maybe I'll just put in his name, Henry Lushbaugh, B-A-U-G-H. Okay, so it comes up with 3 possible records. The first 2 are probably the right ones. Here I have the pension number, and that matches the pension number that I already have. I could also search up here by pension number. So what am I going to see? I have a 20-page Revolutionary War pension, and I have an index card. The index card isn't going to be very interesting, but the pension record is. This is everything that's in his pension file when he was applying to the government to get a military pension. And I've looked at this already, and there's one page in particular that's easy to read and interesting. And this is a letter that the pension people have sent to somebody that was already doing genealogy on Henry Lushbaugh, and it's dated 1928. So they are telling this person that the Revolutionary War pension is for Henry Lushbaugh in Sunbury, Pennsylvania in 1776. He was a private under Captain Harris in Cook's 12th Pennsylvania Regiment. He was in the battles of Piscataway and Ash Swamp, and he served 3 years. He was given his pension on June 3rd, 1818, and at that time he was living in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and he was 67 years old. In 1920, he was living in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, and he referred to his wife Elizabeth, aged 57, and his stepdaughter Nancy, aged 11. there is no further family data. The only noted soldier, the above is the only Henry Lushbow in their records. So this is why you want to go after a pension record, because you can get information like this, that in the 1820s, this information is not anywhere. Elizabeth is not named in a census. The daughter is not named in the census. And from this, I can further research what's the deal with the battles of Piscataway, which I think is in New York, and Ash Swamp. Who were these colonels? What kinds of conditions were they serving under? And I can find out a lot more information. So besides what we saw in the pension file, there was another item in his file that talked about what his assets were. You can learn a lot about a family by looking at things like this. I think that at this point in time, they had to prove that they needed benefits. So he outlines exactly what he owned: a horse, a table, a pot, a chair, etc. His assets were worth $36. He also stated that he lived with his wife Elizabeth and a stepdaughter Nancy. This can help indicate that he was married previously. And also, we've got the name of two women in the early 1800s who were certainly never in census records, so that's great. And also, he was a shoemaker by trade, and we can get an image of his signature. So there's a lot of great stuff in these files. Another thing that was in the file was his final pay statement. And the last date of pay is a good indicator of death, right? The government's not going to pay him after he died. So here we have Henry, and it talks about the amount that he received, and his final pay was in September of 1841. Okay, let's follow a similar process for the War of 1812. This is the last conflict I'm going to show this morning. And the first step that you want to do is try to find the family in the 1810 and 1820 census or tax records. This would mean looking for his father probably in 1810, because those are not every name census. It's only the head of the household. You also need to identify what country he might have fought for. It's possible that the family were loyalists and fought for England, so you can't assume. But if you're lucky, there might be some local books about War of 1812 soldiers in your area. You might have newspaper articles, tombstones, family lore. But there's a lot less of this available for the War of 1812 than for the Civil War. And also because we don't have the every name census, you might not even know where the soldier was living. So at this point, you probably don't have too much information besides a name and a location. So we're going to have to move on to military records pretty quick to see if we can find a person with the right name in the right place. Now, I have a potential service member for the War of 1812. His name was Richard Pleasance, and he was living in Albemarle County, Virginia, in both the 1810 and 1820 census. According to this chart, he would be the right age range for those serving in the War of 1812. And generally, you'll find it's the sons or grandsons of those that fought in the Revolutionary War that will have fought in the War of 1812. I'm using the male gender here because until World War II, very few women were in the regular U.S. Army forces, and even fewer received military benefits for their service. In fact, exactly one woman received a military pension for the Revolutionary War and one for the Civil War. Someone named Deborah Sampson, who enlisted under the name of Robert Shurtleff. And in the Civil War, someone named Sarah Edmonds, who was in the 2nd Michigan Infantry under the name of Franklin Flint Thompson. But anyways, getting back to this, now that I have a name and a birth location, I'm going to head to the Family Search Wiki. We should never forget about the power of the Family Search Wiki. Right now I'm at the home page of Family Search, and I'm going to go to the Family Search Wiki, which is an encyclopedia of genealogical information, including a lot of links to resources that are helpful. So I click on search and I pull down to the word Research Wiki. That brings up the main page of the wiki. And I'm going to search on the War of 1812. Okay, and I'm going to pick the category that shows up, the War of 1812, which was from 1812 to 1815. And it brings up some general information about the war, countries involved in the war. How do you find a War of 1812 soldier? So you can click on that beginning War of 1812 research, and it asks what country did they serve. So here we're doing US, so I'll go down to US records. And then it talks about first try to identify an ancestor that was living in the US during that time. Okay, we've already done that, and our target is Richard Pleasants of Virginia. So then if I scroll down, it talks about links to all different kinds of records. And I just happen to know that the War of 1812 pension files are excellent. And I'm going to skip down to there. But what I would do if I didn't know that, I would just start clicking on these links looking for someone named Richard Pleasants. I'm going to go down to the War of 1812 pension files. Those are on fold 3, and that link takes me directly into fold 3 because this is a free collection and I don't need to have any kind of membership. I don't have to go to the library district website. I'm going to start drilling down. This is a very hierarchical database, so I'm going to search on the War of 1812 by clicking More Conflicts or See All, and I'll click that. And then I'm going to type in his name, Richard Pleasants. Okay, and it's telling me that there is one pension index file and 15 files, general pension files, letter by the Judge Advocate General. So I would need to go down and check all of these out. There's a military land bounty. But let's try the pension files, okay? 9 of the people are in Virginia. I know that my guy is in Virginia. And I look down and there's Pleasants. So there's one Pleasant surname in Virginia in the War of 1812 pension files. And it's Richard S. That's a pretty good start because we know our guy's name was Richard. And that brings up the pension file. So these pension files are scanned in their entirety. This page looks interesting with the red dot. Okay, this is the summary file that is in a pension file that the person in the government filled out, kind of summarizing all of the different information that's in the file. So we've got, he's in the state of Virginia. Richard Pleasants is deceased at this point. He was drafted. He was in Field's company, Charlottesville, Albemarle County, which is the right place. So this is being filed by the widow. The widow said her late husband served as a fifer. And the widow is Zephora Hicks. And that I know for sure this is my guy because Zephora Hicks is his wife and there's only one of them. It talks about where he was living. It talks about where they got married. Who married them? Pastor Irving married them on the 25th of December, 1806, Christmas wedding. Zephora signed with her mark. So there is a lot of genealogical information in here, and I would go through and I would read every document because there is more information in there than what is shown here, and I'll show you that in a minute. This is the actual document that's the proof of marriage in the pension file. And what it says is that Nancy Pleasants, when she was a young girl, she was present when Zephora Hicks Pleasants, then Zephora Hicks, was married to Richard S. Pleasants, and the marriage was performed by Parsons Irving, who has long since died, and the marriage was during the Christmas holidays and was some years before the War of 1812. So from that, the government said, yeah, they were married on Christmas Day, but This is the actual testimony that led to the proof of marriage. And this is why we go after military records. In the early 1800s, there are very few vital records that were kept. There's not a lot of information about women. And this information may be the only information you're going to get that documents a woman's maiden name or a marriage date. I just want to point out one last website, and that is this website called Online Military Indexes. It's at militaryindexes.com, which is shown down here at the bottom. And there are a lot of additional indexes. This is kind of like the Family Search Wiki, but has some different websites. So please go to the Family Search Wiki as well as this page. Thank you for coming to this presentation on military records presented on behalf of the Santa Clara County Historical and Genealogical Society. Here is a list of some of our upcoming events at the beginning of 2026. I hope that you'll consider becoming a member and support our mission and join us for some of these talks and classes. You can register for these things from our website, scchgs.org. And for the Getting Started classes, the registration opens about 6 weeks prior to the class. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something today.